30,000 men died trying to take one fortress. The fortress never fell. That is not legend inflated by Albanian oral tradition. That is the documented mathematical reality of what happened between May 14th and October 11th, 1450, when Sultan Murad II brought 100,000 Ottoman warriors to crush Kruje fortress, defended by 4,000 Albanians, and lost the largest army ever assembled for a single siege without breaching a single wall. By autumn, the empire's most devastating military force was fleeing through mountain fog, 30,000 corpses carpeting the approaches to a fortress that should have fallen in days. Their confidence shattered by Highlanders who weaponized geography itself. This is the story of how Skanderbeg transformed mountain fog into tactical invisibility, how cliffside paths invisible to lowland armies became highways for Albanian cavalry strikes, and how intimate knowledge of homeland terrain proved more lethal than any numerical advantage empires could assemble. But before we talk about the 5 months that stopped Ottoman expansion for 18 years, you need to understand the nightmare scenario facing Albanian resistance in spring 1450. On May 14th, 1450, the dying empire's greatest army marched toward what should have been easy conquest. 100,000 Ottoman warriors, the largest force Sultan Murad II had ever assembled in 3 decades of conquest, stretched across the Albanian mountains like a plague of steel and silk banners that seemed to have no end. At their head rode the Sultan himself alongside his crown prince, Mehmed, future conqueror of Constantinople, being trained in the art of siege warfare. Their destination was a single mountain fortress perched 500 meters above the surrounding plain, defended by fewer than 4,000 Albanian souls under command of Rana Conti. The mathematics were laughable according to every military principle. 25 Ottoman warriors for every Christian defender. Yet by autumn that mighty host would flee in complete disarray, their banners trampled in mountain mud, their reputation as invincible conquerors shattered forever by men they had outnumbered overwhelmingly. Picture yourself standing on the walls of Kruje fortress at dawn, watching an ocean of enemy banners blacken every horizon. 100,000 men, enough warriors to populate entire medieval cities, their ranks stretching as far as eyes could see. Their supply train alone stretched 15 kilometers through the mountain passes, groaning under the weight of massive siege engines, bronze cannons firing 200-pound stone balls, and provisions for the largest military expedition in Ottoman history. Supporting this killing machine came an artillery train of unprecedented size that had reduced other fortresses to rubble. But here is what the Ottoman chronicles written in Constantinople do not tell you about this campaign's true objective. Murad II was not just attacking a fortress in some remote Albanian mountains. He was attempting to erase the most dangerous man in the Balkans from existence itself. Gurga Kastrioti Skanderbeg, the Albanian who had escaped Ottoman slavery to become Christianity's most feared champion, had already humiliated the empire in 30 separate battles over 10 years. From his mountain stronghold at Kruje, this former Ottoman officer, who knew their tactics intimately, had united fractured Albanian clans into an unstoppable guerrilla force that embarrassed the empire repeatedly. The timing could not have been worse for Albanian morale going into this siege. Just 2 years earlier, Ottoman treachery had delivered devastating blows to Skanderbeg's confederation. Svetigrad, the strategic gateway fortress controlling routes from Macedonia into Albania, had fallen after its own garrison opened the gates to an 80,000-strong Ottoman army through bribery and threats. The defenders, composed of Albanians, Bulgarians, and other European volunteers, had held against impossible odds until poison in their wells and betrayal from within sealed their fate. Then came the night assault on Berat, captured through Ottoman treachery that cost Skanderbeg his most powerful ally, when Gheorghe Arianiti abandoned the cause in complete despair over these losses. By spring 1450, Albanian resistance seemed finished to outside observers. Ottoman Akinci raiders burned villages with impunity across the countryside. Refugees fled in columns toward Venetian ports, abandoning ancestral lands their families had held for generations. Even Skanderbeg's closest military advisors whispered privately of negotiated surrender before total annihilation. The smart strategic money said the Albanian experiment in resistance was over. Yet something extraordinary stirred in the mountain air around Kruje that spring as Ottoman scouts approached. When news arrived of Murad's approaching host, Albanian priests claimed visions of angels flying protectively over their homeland. Skanderbeg himself declared publicly that St. George had appeared to him in a prophetic dream, handing him a flaming sword to destroy the enemies of true Christian religion. Whether divine intervention or desperate psychology designed to stiffen resolve, these visions transformed Albanian despair into fanatical determination to resist. The fortress they would defend occupied one of Europe's most formidable natural positions. Kruje's ancient walls crowned a rocky pinnacle that rose like a stone fist from the Albanian mountains, its sides protected by sheer cliffs that made conventional assault nearly impossible without siege towers. Two natural springs within the fortified courtyard guaranteed water independence during siege. The approaches were so narrow that thousands of attackers would funnel into killing zones where Albanian crossbow bolts could find exposed flesh with devastating accuracy. As Murad's vast army wound through the mountain passes toward this seemingly impossible target, neither side knew they were racing toward the most shocking military reversal in medieval Balkan warfare. The Albanian highlands trembled under the weight of history's largest siege army as it arrived. At dawn on May 15th, Ottoman war drums echoed through valleys that had known relative peace for generations, their rhythmic thunder announcing the empire's arrival at Kruje's gates with overwhelming force. From the fortress walls, Albanian sentries watched in horrified fascination as Murad's host deployed across 3 square kilometers of mountainside, their silk banners snapping in the morning wind like the wings of carrion birds gathering for a feast. The numbers were staggering beyond human comprehension to defenders. 80,000 battle-hardened Sipahi cavalry formed the army's professional backbone, their recurved composite bows capable of punching arrows through mail armor at 200 paces. 20,000 Azab infantry carried the siege ladders, grappling hooks, and mining tools that would reduce Albanian walls to rubble through sustained assault. Supporting this killing machine came bronze cannons capable of hurling 400-pound stone balls against fortifications with bone-shattering impact every 10 minutes of sustained bombardment. Inside Kruje's ancient walls, Vrana Conti surveyed his pitifully small garrison with the outward calm of a commander who had already accepted death as inevitable. 4,000 Albanian defenders total, including barely 800 trained soldiers, and the rest local militia armed with farming tools, hastily converted to weapons of war. The contrast was obscene by any military calculation. 25 Ottoman warriors for every Albanian soul defending these walls. Conti had commanded fortress defenses before during his military career, but never against odds that violated every principle of military mathematics so completely. Here is where the situation became truly desperate beyond simple numbers. Skanderbeg himself was not even present inside the fortress for the opening bombardment. The Albanian commander had taken 8,000 of his best troops, including 6,000 cavalry that represented the core of Albanian striking power, and positioned them on Mount Tumanishta, 3 kilometers north of the fortress in the mountains. His strategy defied conventional siege warfare wisdom completely. Rather than concentrating all available forces behind Kruje's walls, where they could support each other, he deliberately weakened the garrison to maintain an external striking force. To Ottoman observers studying this deployment, it looked like tactical insanity that would doom both forces. The first Ottoman assault came at noon on May 15th, with devastating precision that demonstrated decades of siege experience. Wave after wave of Azab infantry charged up Kruje's narrow approach paths, their war cries echoing off stone cliffs as siege ladders scraped against Albanian battlements. Albanian crossbow bolts found their marks with deadly accuracy honed through years of defending these walls. But for every Ottoman warrior who fell screaming, 3 more pressed forward over their bodies. The mathematics of attrition favored the attackers overwhelmingly. Then something extraordinary happened that Ottoman chroniclers later struggled to explain in their reports. At the height of the assault, as Albanian defenders were being overwhelmed along the eastern wall section, Ottoman artillery crews made a catastrophic error while attempting to provide fire support for their advancing infantry. The cannoneers misjudged the range completely and began dropping 400-pound stone balls directly into their own assault formations, climbing the approaches. The friendly fire was devastating beyond imagination. Entire companies of Azov infantry simply disintegrated under their own artillery, blood and bone matter painting the mountainside in crimson streaks visible from kilometers away. What happened next defied all military logic developed over centuries. Instead of pressing their advantage while Albanian defenders reeled from the bombardment's psychological impact, Ottoman commanders called off the assault entirely in confusion. The sight of their own cannons massacring Turkish infantry had shattered unit cohesion completely, turning organized assault into panicked retreat down the mountain. But Murad II had not conquered half the Balkans by accepting tactical setbacks gracefully. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Albanian mountains, Ottoman military engineers began the methodical work of professional siege warfare. Massive mining operations commenced against Kruje's foundations, teams of specialists tunneling toward the fortress walls with tools designed to bring down the mightiest fortifications in Europe. The plan was simple and had worked at dozens of other sieges. Undermine the walls systematically, pack the tunnels with gunpowder charges, and reduce Skanderbeg's stronghold to rubble through controlled explosions. The miners worked in 3-hour shifts, their picks ringing against stone in rhythm with Albanian defenders' growing desperation. Each hammer blow brought the empire closer to inevitable victory. Each shovel of excavated earth represented another step toward Albanian annihilation. By sunset on May 15th, Ottoman confidence had returned completely. Tomorrow would bring Kruje's destruction through proven engineering, and with it the final chapter of Albanian resistance. At dawn on May 16th, the Ottoman miners struck solid bedrock that stopped their progress completely. Their picks, which had chewed efficiently through soil and softer stone throughout the night, suddenly rang against granite foundations laid by Byzantine engineers 5 centuries earlier. The sound echoed through the tunnels like a death knell for Ottoman hopes of quick victory. Kruje had not just been built on top of a mountain in some conventional sense. It had been carved directly from the mountain itself, its walls rising from living rock that no amount of digging could undermine. Ottoman engineers reported the devastating news to Sultan Murad as morning mist rolled through the Albanian peaks, carrying with it an omen that would transform this siege forever. Mountain fog, thick as wool and cold as winter breath, began settling into the valleys surrounding Kruje with unnatural persistence that lasted for days. What seemed like mere weather to Ottoman observers accustomed to Anatolian plains was actually salvation for Albanian defenders who'd grown up in these highlands, men who could navigate fog-shrouded mountain paths as easily as walking through their own homes. Here is where legend meets brutal documented reality in the chronicle. While Ottoman forces huddled in their camps, waiting for the mist to clear before resuming operations, Skanderbeg launched the most audacious guerrilla campaign in medieval warfare, using geography as his primary weapon. Using cliffside paths, invisible to lowland armies, unfamiliar with the terrain, Albanian cavalry descended from Mount Tumanishta like phantoms materializing from the fog itself. Their first target was a supply convoy from Macedonia carrying vital provisions. 18 ox-drawn wagons carrying enough grain, dried meat, and siege equipment to feed 20,000 Ottoman soldiers for a week. The Albanian attack came at precisely 6:30 in the morning, timed to the minute when fog density reached its peak and visibility dropped to 15 meters. Ottoman guards never saw their killers approach through the mountain mist that concealed everything. Crossbow bolts whispered through white silence, finding throats and hearts with surgical precision before victims could raise alarm. Within minutes, the entire convoy lay butchered, their valuable cargo of provisions now fueling Albanian resistance instead of Ottoman conquest. But Skanderbeg's tactical genius went far beyond simple supply raids that any guerrilla could accomplish. He understood that mountain fog created a tactical revolution in warfare. Visibility dropped to 15 meters maximum, making Ottoman numerical superiority completely meaningless. Large military formations became death traps, unable to coordinate movement or identify friend from foe in the white blindness. Albanian fighters operating in small groups of 12 to 20 men could strike anywhere along the Ottoman perimeter and vanish before reinforcements arrived to counterattack. The psychological impact on Ottoman morale was devastating beyond battlefield casualties. Ottoman soldiers who had conquered half of Europe over decades found themselves terrorized by an enemy they could not see, could not catch, and could not predict, using conventional tactics. Every morning brought fresh horror discovered in the fog. Supply wagons found empty with their guards' bodies arranged in grotesque warnings. Patrol units discovered with their weapons missing and their horses stolen. Even high-ranking Ottoman officers assassinated in their own tents by Albanian infiltrators who moved through fog like avenging spirits. Within 1 week of sustained operations, Ottoman camp discipline collapsed entirely. Soldiers refused patrol duty outright. Supply officers demanded massive cavalry escorts for simple foraging expeditions. Disease began spreading through the overcrowded camps as sanitation broke down amid constant fear of Albanian attack from any direction. The mighty Ottoman war machine, designed to crush enemies through overwhelming coordinated force, found itself paralyzed by an opponent who refused to fight by any conventional rules. Meanwhile, inside Kruje's walls, Rana Conti received a visitor that would test Albanian resolve to its breaking point. A richly dressed Ottoman pasha arrived under flag of truce with ceremonial honors. His camels were loaded with silk fabrics, gold coins, and precious stones worth enough to purchase entire kingdoms. The offer was simple and generous by any standard. Surrender Kruje, acknowledge Ottoman sovereignty, and receive wealth beyond imagination or peaceful cooperation. The alternative was death for every soul within the fortress walls when it eventually fell. Conti's response would echo through Albanian oral tradition for centuries afterward. Without examining the treasure, without consulting his officers, he replied with words that turned bribery into insult. Murad's gold could not purchase what Albanian blood had already paid for. The Pasha departed empty-handed, carrying news that would enrage the Sultan and seal Kruje's fate as the empire's most hated target. By month's end, Ottoman confidence had transformed into something approaching panic as Skanderbeg's mountain warfare rendered their massive army increasingly irrelevant. By mid-June, Sultan Murad II faced a crisis that threatened to destroy his hard-earned reputation forever. Daily Albanian raids had reduced his supply situation to catastrophic levels that endangered the entire campaign. Ottoman soldiers, accustomed to campaigns where victory came through overwhelming force, applied systematically found themselves on quarter rations, while enemy laughter echoed from fog-shrouded mountainsides. The empire's largest army was being starved into submission by 12,000 Albanian Highlanders who struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. The Sultan's solution revealed both desperation and cunning in equal measure. If military might could not break Albanian resolve, perhaps gold could succeed where steel had failed. On June 18th, Murad dispatched his most persuasive envoy directly to Skanderbeg's camp on Mount Tuminishta, bearing an offer unprecedented in Ottoman diplomatic history: 10,000 golden crowns annually for life, recognition as an autonomous prince within the empire, and co-rulership over all Albanian territories. For a mountain chieftain leading a handful of highland warriors against an empire, it was wealth and power beyond imagination. Skanderbeg's response became the stuff of legend across Christian Europe within weeks. Without hesitation, without consulting his war council, he delivered words that Ottoman chroniclers recorded with grudging admiration. Even if Murad offered to make me co-partner in his entire empire, I would never suffer the name of Albania to be stained with this disgrace and infamy. The envoy departed, carrying news that would transform imperial frustration into imperial rage. What happened next defied every precedent of siege warfare that had evolved over centuries. Instead of accepting his generous offer's rejection gracefully and withdrawing to fight another day, Murad ordered the largest simultaneous assault in Ottoman military history. At dawn on June 20th, the entire 100,000-man army would attack Kruje from all directions simultaneously, overwhelming Albanian defenders through sheer mass regardless of casualties. It was mathematical warfare reduced to its purest, most brutal form. Throw enough bodies at the walls, and eventually they must fall through attrition. Here is what the Ottoman battle plan could not account for despite careful preparation. Albanian mountain warfare had evolved beyond anything Islamic military science understood or could counter. As Ottoman assault columns formed in the pre-dawn darkness, Skanderbeg's external forces moved through familiar, fog-shrouded paths to positions that would transform the coming battle into a massacre. The Ottomans were about to discover that attacking a mountain fortress required more than courage and overwhelming numbers. It required understanding terrain that Albanians had called home for 1,000 years. The assault began at sunrise with a thunderclap of bronze cannons that shook the mountains themselves with sound. 400-pound stone balls crashed against Kruje's walls with impacts that could be heard 15 kilometers away across valleys, while 20,000 Azab infantry charged up the narrow approach paths, screaming prayers to Allah and promises of Albanian blood. From the fortress battlements, Vrana Conti's 4,000 defenders unleashed volleys of crossbow bolts that dropped Ottoman attackers in windrows of dead. But still they came in waves, climbing over their own dead to reach Albanian steel. But the real carnage began when Skanderbeg's 8,000 cavalry struck the Ottoman rear guard at precisely 7:30 in the morning, just as the main assault reached its crescendo against the walls. Using mountain paths invisible to lowland armies, Albanian horsemen materialized from morning mist like avenging angels, their war cry of St. George drowning out Ottoman battle prayers. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating to Ottoman cohesion. Ottoman soldiers, who'd been pressing forward with fanatic determination, suddenly found enemies attacking from behind in terrain they did not know. Their carefully planned assault dissolving into chaotic slaughter. Within 17 minutes of sustained combat, Ottoman military formation collapsed entirely across the entire battlefield. Soldiers fled in panic through unfamiliar mountain terrain, many falling to their deaths from cliffs they could not see through persistent fog. The mathematical certainty of Ottoman victory had become algebraic impossibility, as Albanian knowledge of terrain transformed 100,000 attackers into 100,000 targets trapped in killing grounds they had never recognized. By noon, Sultan Murad II faced a truth that would haunt Ottoman expansion for decades. Sometimes courage and overwhelming numbers were not enough to overcome an enemy fighting for their ancestral homeland with intimate geographic knowledge. The silence that followed the Ottoman retreat was more terrifying than the battle itself had been. Where 100,000 warriors had stood at dawn, only scattered corpses and abandoned equipment marked their passage by sunset. Albanian defenders emerging from Kruje's walls like men awakening from nightmares found themselves walking through a graveyard that stretched across 15 square kilometers of mountainside. The arithmetic of destruction defied comprehension by any historical standard. An empire's largest army had simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. The casualty reports when they finally reached Sultan Murad's tent read like documents from an apocalyptic vision. 30,000 Ottoman dead carpeted the approaches to Kruje, their bodies forming literal bridges of flesh across ravines where panic-stricken soldiers had trampled their own comrades in desperate flight. Another 40,000 wounded or missing. Most lost to mountain cliffs they could not navigate while fleeing through fog. The empire's finest Sipahi cavalry, 80,000 strong that morning, had been reduced to fewer than 20,000 effective fighters by an enemy they had outnumbered 25 to 1. By contrast, Albanian losses seemed almost miraculous to observers. Vrana Conti's garrison had lost 800 men defending the fortress walls, while Skanderbeg's external forces suffered fewer than 200 casualties despite conducting the most audacious cavalry charge in medieval warfare. The mathematical impossibility of these casualty figures prompted Ottoman chroniclers to seek supernatural explanations in their reports. Surely only divine intervention could explain such devastating reversal of fortune. Here is what the chronicles do not tell you about psychological warfare's true power. The sight of Sultan Murad II, conqueror of Belgrade and scourge of Hungary, fleeing on a pack mule while his empire's greatest army disintegrated around him, shattered Ottoman military mystique throughout the Balkan. Word of Kruje's impossible defense spread like wildfire through Christian Europe, carried by Venetian merchants who had witnessed the aftermath firsthand. Within weeks, Albanian resistance had transformed from desperate last stand into inspiration for every oppressed people from Poland to Byzantium. The material consequences were equally staggering beyond human casualties. Scattered across the Albanian mountainsides lay enough abandoned Ottoman equipment to outfit 10 armies. Bronze cannons worth their weight in gold. Siege engines that had conquered Constantinople's outer fortifications. Thousands of recurved bows, crafted by the finest weaponsmiths in Anatolia. Most valuable of all was the Sultan's war chest, abandoned in retreat. 50,000 gold pieces intended to finance the entire Albanian campaign, now funding Albanian resistance for the next decade. But the strategic implications reached far beyond mere treasure or battlefield victory. For the first time in Ottoman expansion, a small Christian force had demonstrated that imperial armies could be defeated through superior knowledge of terrain and tactical innovation. The myth of Ottoman invincibility, carefully cultivated through decades of conquest, lay as shattered as the corpses littering Kruje's approaches. Skanderbeg himself, surveying the battlefield where his tactical genius had rewritten the rules of medieval warfare, understood the victory's true significance. This was not merely Albanian triumph over Ottoman oppression. It was proof that small nations could preserve their independence against imperial expansion through courage, cunning, and intimate knowledge of their homeland's geography. The fog that had concealed Albanian movements would lift eventually, but the example of Kruje's defense would inspire resistance movements for centuries. As autumn approached, and Ottoman survivors limped back to Anatolia carrying news of their humiliation to every corner of the empire, one fact became undeniably clear. 12,000 Albanian Highlanders had accomplished what the combined armies of Hungary, Poland, and Byzantium had failed to achieve. They had stopped Ottoman expansion cold, bought Christianity an 18-year respite, and proven that even the mightiest empires could bleed when confronted by men fighting for their ancestral soil. The siege of Kruje was over, but its consequences would echo through history like thunder rolling across the Albanian mountains. The reverberations of Kruje's impossible defense reshaped the strategic landscape of southeastern Europe for the next 2 decades. News of Murad II's humiliation reached every Christian court from Rome to Moscow, transforming Skanderbeg from obscure Albanian chieftain into Christianity's most celebrated champion overnight. Pope Nicholas V, who had watched Ottoman expansion with growing despair, immediately proclaimed the victory a divine miracle and began organizing the first serious crusade in generations. Venetian merchants, who controlled trade routes throughout the eastern Mediterranean, suddenly found themselves financing Albanian resistance with enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. The military implications proved even more profound than the political ones for Ottoman doctrine. Ottoman tactical thinking, which had relied on overwhelming numerical superiority since the empire's founding, underwent fundamental revision after Kruje's lessons were absorbed by military strategists in Constantinople. Never again would Ottoman commanders assume that large armies automatically guaranteed victory against defenders who understood their terrain intimately. The empire's subsequent campaigns in the Balkans became exercises in caution, employing smaller, more mobile forces designed to avoid the kind of catastrophic defeat that had befallen Murad's host. European military academies still study Skanderbeg's tactical innovations at Kruje as the definitive example of asymmetric warfare principles. His use of mountain fog as natural concealment, his coordination of internal garrison defense with external cavalry strikes, and his systematic destruction of enemy supply lines while avoiding pitched battles established a template for successful resistance that would be copied by everyone from Swiss mountaineers to American colonists 3 centuries later. But the victory's greatest consequence was psychological rather than purely tactical. For the first time in Ottoman expansion, a small Christian force had demonstrated that imperial armies could be defeated through superior leadership and intimate knowledge of homeland geography. The myth of Ottoman invincibility, carefully cultivated through decades of conquest from the Danube to the Euphrates, lay shattered like the corpses littering Kruje's mountain approaches. The 18-year respite Skanderbeg's victory purchased for Christian Europe cannot be calculated in mere military terms. During those crucial years, while Ottoman attention focused on rebuilding forces shattered at Kruje, Hungarian fortifications were strengthened, Venetian naval power expanded, and papal coalitions organized with renewed confidence. When Ottoman expansion finally resumed under Mehmed II, it faced a Europe that had learned valuable lessons about resisting seemingly unstoppable imperial momentum. If you want to understand how Skanderbeg weaponized mountain fog and cliffside paths against the largest siege army in history, subscribe immediately, because next week we are revealing the exact guerrilla tactics that terrorized 100,000 Ottoman soldiers, the supply raid strategies that starved an empire's army, the fog warfare techniques that made visibility drop to 15 meters, and why intimate knowledge of homeland terrain proved more lethal than any numerical advantage. So, smash that subscribe button now, because understanding how 4,000 Albanians held against 100,000 attackers changes everything you think you know about asymmetric warfare. And the principles proven in those Albanian mountains still influence modern guerrilla doctrine taught today at military academies, where geographic knowledge matters more than counting soldiers.